in a sense, but also something that is often brought up, and people have asked me questions about it, and so I think it's a great time in our study to address it, all right? So Revelation chapter 11. Children, we have the box of treats and candy up here, so take some notes, and we'll be ready to answer a question however you'd like to do it. I'll meet you here at the close of the service, all right? We talked about this interval, this little break that happens right before we get to the seventh trumpet judgment. And as we did last time, we jumped into these first two verses. So let's look there, shall we? Let's read again, Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. And there was given me, reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. We've commented how, boy, there is a lot intimated in these two verses, a lot wrapped up into this transition that happens in Revelation chapter 11, verse 1 and 2. And it kind of opens the door to us considering a whole lot of things. And we asked last time, how do we get here? Well, first we understand the fact that John is gazing upon Jerusalem, that holy city as it's described here, and he sees something that hasn't been there for nearly 2,000 years. He sees a temple. And that would have thrilled his heart, as we pointed out last time, right? And to see this temple, and he's commanded to measure it. We'll get into that in weeks ahead. And then number two, by this time, we said, second observation, by this time in the world events, much has changed politically and geographically for Israel. It can be understood from this passage and others that deal with the time frame that we're talking about, that the Jews have regained possession of the Temple Mount or temple site completely. But also that's happened for some times because they've had the right to do so and to do whatever they want on that mountaintop and the mount, the holy mount. And their desire and purpose is to build that third temple. You might say, well, how is that different than today? What's happening on this mount today? That's a good question. We really didn't hit on it last time. Let me just kind of share with you a basic thing. It's kind of interesting. Since the Six-Day War of 1967, the Israeli government has the control of the Temple Mount as far as managing access to it. And so sometimes we hear of in the news them not allowing access, and all the Muslims and others are in an uproar because they're not allowing people into it and so forth. But what's interesting, the actual Temple Mount, the day-to-day management of it, there's an Islamic entity known as the Hashemite custodianship. They are actually the ones in control of the Temple Mount, the day-to-day management, and that's rooted in Jordan. In fact, they are in charge of many of the so-called holy sites within Jerusalem. It's a weird setup, and so you can imagine what has played into all this political and geographical conflict and everything else. And so that's where it stands today, and it's kind of interesting because even the Muslims, the surrounding nations, they say that Temple Mount is ours, we're in charge of it. In fact, the Jordanian president, of which the Hashemite custodianship is located in fact, they fund and pay the salaries of many who operate the Temple Mount and things like that. He said this a few years ago, and it's quite the statement. He said this: the Hashemite custodianship of Jerusalem's Islamic and Christian holy sites is a duty, a commitment, a firm belief, and a responsibility we have proudly undertaken for more than 100 years. And so what he is saying is that, listen, we're the ones in charge of this, and we are in control. So you see the conflict, right? And Israelis may control the access to the mount, but the actual mount is under the control of this custodialship. So for this to happen, what we read in Revelation chapter 11 and verses 1 and 2, man, there's a whole lot of things that have to change. And we understood from the verses here that there's going to be a time when that temple is indeed rebuilt. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as we delve into tonight's subject matter. We turn to Daniel chapter 9, right, where we study these 70 weeks of Daniel to understand how that's prophesied, and Daniel even alludes to it and speaks about the temple being rebuilt. We saw how these 70 weeks, they kicked off. The beginning of that timeline is established. There was that official decree that is given to rebuild Jerusalem. And that prophecy then takes us through the entire timeline, okay? And I hesitate using timelines. There's always maybe one or two things that I don't think are the best. But anyway, here's kind of the picture that we talked about last time together, and the breakdown of all of these 70 years of prophecy of Daniel's prophecy. And we talked about each one of these aspects and parts of it. That first 7 weeks, you see it up there. You remember the first 7 weeks, the 49 years, the 7 weeks of, or the 7 weeks of 7 years, right? And so that first 7 weeks was the time that it took to rebuild the city and the temple there in Jerusalem, as we saw last time. Then came the 62 weeks. What's the 62 weeks? That's the waiting period for the Messiah to arrive. As Jesus Christ then came to earth, and when he did, the Bible described in the prophecy said that he would be cut off, but not for himself. So Jesus Christ died on the cross of Calvary for your sins, my sins, not his own. And then that propelled us from the end of the 69th week to the beginning of the 7th week. Here's where we're at. And God has, in a sense, hit or pushed the pause button, prophetically speaking. Okay? There's a prophetical timeout, as we might say, with the prophetical clock, starting back up whenever God so chooses. And Romans details, this is because the Jews have rejected their Messiah. And so here we are. This interval, we know it to be the New Testament age, the church age, as described. And that 70th week is going to kick off with the rapture of the church, the beginning of the tribulation as it starts and so forth. And that prince, the Antichrist, will come on the scene. And we looked at Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, that statement, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, for those 7 years. And he'll make this peace treaty, this peace covenant with many, with Israel. It's an unprecedented event. And I mean, think about it. In the last couple days, right? All we're hearing now is World War III and all kinds of things happening now because Iran and Israel, U.S. jumping into. And boy, we think, well, how in the world will there ever be peace? So this is a pretty amazing thought that peace will be brokered there in that area. And it is amazing to think of that, so much so that the Jews are going to be able to reclaim the Temple Mount, build the temple, as we read in Revelation chapter 11 and other passages, and certainly all to the help or through the seeming help of this generous and benevolent leader that will, as we saw last time, in the midst of the week, he'll turn his back on them and really make it severe on Israel. We'll get to that in future messages. But now I want to turn our time to something that is necessary, or something that many people say is necessary and is a prevalent sign that people point to regarding the tribulation. And interesting, you know what it all centers around? It's kind of interesting. It all centers around a red cow. A red cow, okay? Preferably, or most notably reference, the red heifer of the Scriptures. Many of us have heard this, right? We've heard it talked about, and it's thrown out there and presented to us, and there's a whole lot of people that have their antennas up about the red heifer and so forth. And you say, well, what's the big deal? How does it correlate? And I've had this question, how does that correlate to the end times? Why do people talk about this red heifer and so forth? So we're going to look at that a little bit tonight. First of all, I want to step back and just establish from some other passages, besides Daniel chapter 9, that this temple will indeed be rebuilt. Sacrifices will be reinstituted in the future. It's hard to think of that. For however many years, 2,000 or a little under 2,000, those sacrifices have not taken place in Jerusalem. There's been no form or shape of it in Jerusalem. But they will restart again. And there's several passages that speak to this. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31, Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11 speak of something happening in the end times that indicate the temple is going to be rebuilt and sacrifices reinstituted. Okay? Daniel chapter 11 and verse number 31 says this, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. Speaking of the Antichrist, the prince and so forth. So think about that. You can't take away something that hasn't already been there, right? Hasn't already started. So that's a great indicator. Same with Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away. Both the passages are speaking of the end times, things that are going to happen within the tribulation. So therefore, this daily sacrifice will be happening. And as we get into the desolation, and in fact, the passages here speaking of the desolation of abomination committed by the Antichrist, these things will be stopped. So they have to have been going on for some time. The Bible isn't clear how long per se, but from the establishment of the temple to the point of the midpoint of the tribulation, we know there's going to be some daily sacrifices that are transpiring. In fact, Jesus Christ himself spoke about it happening in Mark chapter 13 and verse 14. He references this passage in Daniel, or these passages in Daniel, and saying, listen, the daily sacrifice and so forth, and it's going to be stopped and such. Another great passage is what Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. I know we're throwing a lot at you, but this is just historically establishing biblically the third temple being built. Okay? Here's what happens. Who opposes, speaking of the Antichrist, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worship. And notice what it says, in the tribulation, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Hence the term, the desolation of abominations, right? He establishes himself as God, and we'll see. He walks into the temple of Jerusalem, and he says, listen, I am God. He's the Antichrist, right? He establishes himself as such. And we'll look at that desolation abomination. There's a lot to it in the scriptures, and subsequent weeks we'll look at it, okay? But there's going to be sacrifices in the temple at the time of the Antichrist and the tribulation. And if that's the case, there must be a temple that is erected either before the tribulation or during the early first parts of the tribulation so that this can happen, right? So if you were to talk to many Jews today, especially Orthodox Jews, they would tell you that one of their heart's desire is to see the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem, to use it as part of their worship of Jehovah. Many feel they are not fulfilling the biblical Old Testament requirements for worshiping Jehovah until that happens. And so they're praying for it, they're asking for it. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is kind of how it plays out recently, just as they know that, Israel's enemies will do anything from stopping them or to stop them from building the temple, from gaining control of the Temple Mount and establishing this. And you think of all their enemies. Well, one that's been in the news recently is Hamas, right? We all know Hamas and the Islamic terror organization. They harbor a deep-seated hatred for Israel. And they would love to do nothing else, along with Iran and Hezbollah and all of everybody else, to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And they repeatedly try to do so. In fact, they would themselves will say, we're waging war in conquest against Israel. So, as Hamas, this is their desire and such. That brings us to, or brought us to, just a couple years ago, right? October 7th, 2023. One of the worst days in modern history of Israel. The attacks there and the murder and killing of people, some still held as hostages from that day. Even then, Hamas and these connected military groups and attacked Israel. And of course, like the cowards they are, they attacked them during a Jewish holiday. And when you imagine people celebrating and do other things. And so we know that that happened. Well, what was interesting about this and where it applies to some of this is, do you remember what they called it? What Hamas titled their attack on Israel? They called it the owl, and forgive me if I mispronounce it because I'm sure I will. I don't speak that language. Okay, the Al-Aqsa flood. The Al-Aqsa flood. Where did they get this term? Where does that name come from? Well, it's kind of interesting because the Al-Aqsa mosque is the one located there in Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting because it is the great domed mosque there on the Temple Mount. It rests upon the southern retaining wall of the mount structure. It's much less known to the people of the world than the fellow dome. You see, I put it in there, the iconic Dome of the Rock that's on the Holy Mount. Most people recognize that immediately. What's interesting is that the entire compound located there in the Temple Mount, it's revered by Muslims. In fact, they hold it as the third most holy site in the world. It's behind Mecca and Medina. So why did they call this October 7th attack that started some 75 miles away from Jerusalem as the Al-Aqsa flood? Certainly a reference to that. Well, most of the media that covered the attack, and I would just insert here, as Brother Dylan has mentioned to us that you can't really trust our own media, but as most of the media missed and did not catch, they didn't see the significance of the name. But there was a huge significance for devout Muslims. As they heard this name, it really was for them an issuing of a rallying cry. A shout out to the Palestinians living in the West Bank, Hezbollah operating in Lebanon, to all Muslims residing in that region, issuing that call to join them in a jihad against Jerusalem, intended to flood Jerusalem and seize them out. They were hoping that the beginnings of October 7th was the beginning of the Gaza war that would just flood and like a tidal wave run into Jerusalem, recapture the Temple Mount completely for themselves, and overthrow Israel. This is their dream, their pipe dream, if you might describe it as such. Don't take my word for it. It's interesting that the confirmation of that goal and mission was given by Hamas itself. On the 100th day anniversary of October 7th, so the next year, 2024, Abu Ubaidah, who is the military spokesman or the spokesman for the military arm of Hamas, he gave a recorded statement. And it was to explain why they did this, the goal, the mission of the attack, how successful it's been in their eyes, and so forth. Why that Gaza war was waged. So he celebrated Hamas, what they had accomplished in that massacre on October 7th and the subsequent days of war. But he notably emphasized the reason for the Al-Aqsa flood. What did he say? Well, he said that it was in response to Jewish Zionist religious beliefs who they fear are pushing harder and harder for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque amid the establishment of a new temple. So you catch what he's saying? Here's a Hamas leader, and they are fearful that the Jews are going to establish a new temple on the Temple Mount, that they're just going to get rid of the mosques that are there, and they're going to take over, they're going to build this temple. They themselves, may I just say this? I think they themselves understand what the prophecy says. And they're going to do all they can to prevent Israel from building this temple. It's quite amazing, but it gets even better. As he's saying this in this recorded presentation and proclamation, you know what he says? Listen to this. This is what he says. Quote, he says this. He declared as proof that these guys are trying to overthrow that mosque, and so we had to defend it and so forth. Here's what he said. He declared, quote, the Jews are bringing red cows to the Holy Land. So this is a Hamas leader, and he's espousing, listen, part of the reason October 7th happened and why we felt the need to attack Israel was because the Jews are bringing red cows to the Holy Land. What's the significance there? Do they want hamburgers? I mean, think about it. Here's a Hamas leader. He understands there's something significant about red cows being brought to Israel. And in fact, it's true. He was right. Notice what this one article presents as established facts to what he said, and confirms that what he said is true. The Jews are doing just that. In fact, just a year or so earlier, the cows he was referring to, the red heifers, they were brought to Israel in 2022. Great fanfare and excitement by what is this pronounced? I can't speak Hebrew, okay? Of Jerusalem, a group committed to seeing the third Jewish temple rebuilt in the Holy City. The Israeli group had earlier embarked on an extensive search for the rare animals before discovering a Christian farmer in Texas who was a breeder of red heifers. Special permission was obtained to import the animals into Israel. Now, that's a great statement, isn't it? Okay. And other articles reveal that they were stealthily brought into, after being celebrated, they were stealthily moved to a secure private farm, secret farm in Israel, where they're kept and prepared for a special task. So the question there, it begs itself, what is the big deal about the red heifer? Why is this so significant that Hamas sees this and says, oh, wait a minute, we've got to stop this? This is an indicator that they're getting ready for rebuilding the temple and so forth. That's why, down through the years, Christians who have studied the Bible, they've kept an eye on the mention of Israel and red cows or red heifers. And several centuries. In fact, I own books that describe, going back, I got one from my father, then as he was a pastor 50 years ago, 1960-something, and people are keeping an eye out for the red heifers, and already back then, Israel was looking for cows, they were looking for the red heifers and so forth. And there's been a process and a desire and a journey that they have taken to pursue the breeding of red heifers in Israel, finding them and so forth. In anticipation and looking forward to the rebuilding of the temple. The Temple Institute of Jerusalem, there's another group that's really behind it, pushing it. The rebuilding of the temple there in Jerusalem. Here's what they state clearly and bluntly about how important the red cow is to any plan to build a new temple. Okay? Notice what they say. This is a strong statement. In fact, I think this picture came from the Temple Institute. The Temple Institute says this. Why the big deal about the red heifers? Here's what they say on their website. But in truth, the fate of the entire world depends on the red heifer. Aren't you glad to know that? The entire world depends on a red heifer, okay? We'll get to the end of the message. We'll see, all right, the Jews take it a little bit farther than certainly we do and biblically should be. But here's how they feel. The truth, the fate of the entire world depends on the red heifer. For God has ordained that its ashes alone are the single missing ingredient for the reinstatement of biblical purity and thereafter the rebuilding of the holy temple. So immediately you and I are introduced to the reality that, okay, in the Jews' eyes, for sure, this red heifer is crucial. So they've spent millions of dollars preparing, finding, getting these red heifers to Israel, Jerusalem, in preparation of the building of the temple. And you and I might say, what is the big deal about a red cow? Glad you asked. Let's find out from scriptures, okay? What's the significance? Because it's alluded to even in this statement. Would you turn in your Bibles with me to Numbers chapter 19? Let's see how this plays out in relation to what we see and why there's such comments and people looking and talking about a red heifer in Israel down through the ages and specifically down through the last 50, 60, 70 years. Numbers chapter 19, okay, will show us how God has given the purification, ceremonial purification instructions for people to be cleansed from their uncleanness. You saw the statement from the Temple Institute that referenced this. There has to be a purification before the temple can be rebuilt and people work in it, priests, and so forth. So this is what they're speaking of when they allude to the red heifer. And the red heifer was used as a means of purification for people and for objects. We'll see this in the passage. Look at verse number 1 with me. Let's read the entire section here down through verse 9 just to kind of get the picture. Okay? And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord had commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. And ye shall give her unto Eleazar the priest, that ye may bring her forth without the camp, and one shall slay her before his face. And Eleazar the priest shall take of her blood with his finger, and sprinkle of her blood directly before the tabernacle or the temple of the congregation 7 times. And as one shall burn the heifer in his sight, her skin, her flesh, and her blood with her dung shall he burn. And the priest shall take cedar wood and hyssop and scarlet and cast into the midst of the burning of the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, and he shall bathe his flesh in water, and afterward he shall come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean unto the even. Verse 8, and he that burneth her shall wash his clothes in water, and bathe his flesh in water, and shall be unclean unto the even. Verse 9, and a man that is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, lay them up without the camp in a clean place, and it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for a water of separation. It is a purification of sin. Okay, so let's note some things right away about this sacrifice of the red heifer that is spoken of here specifically for the purification process. Okay, number one, kind of interesting. You probably already picked up on it as we read those 9 verses. This sacrifice stands out from other sacrifices in several ways. It is a unique commandment in the Mosaic law that this red heifer was to be without, obviously, defect and blemish, and was to never have borne a yoke. Okay, that's verse 2. The sacrifice also of the red heifer was unique in the law that it used a female animal. Okay, it was very different from the other sacrifices and such. It was to be sacrificed to away from the entrance. It wasn't in the courtyard. It wasn't at the normal place where the sacrifices were slain. Kind of reminiscent of the escape lamb, right? The lamb that was let go and so forth and such. Okay, slaughtered, or the one that wasn't. They slaughtered outside the camp or outside the tabernacle area. Also, this is kind of interesting, it is a sacrifice in which the only one in which the color was specified. This red heifer and was sacrificed and such. Now, what's interesting about that, there's some clear uniqueness to this sacrifice just from the biblical mandates. Well, what do the Jews often do? Well, down through the years, they have their Mishnah, they have their rabbinical writings, and they always add extra kind of qualifications to a lot of these sacrifices. And so today, in their practice and what they're looking for, they've added some extra requirements that are derived from the rabbinical writings and teachings and even from oral tradition. It includes the exact type of rope the red heifer was to be bound with, the direction it was to face when being slaughtered. And they say it has to be perfect in redness. What does that mean? This is literally what they believe, that the presence of as few as 2 hairs of any other color render it unusable. Now, I'll tell you, okay, Brother Mark and others might have experience. I've never looked through a cow to see if I can find 2 hairs of a different color. Wouldn't you love to be the Jew with that task? To search and find out, okay, we just got to find 2 hairs that don't match, and if that is, we can't use it. It's no longer usable. That's literally what they believe. And so you can imagine the process that they are going through. And they even believe that its hooves have to be red. Okay, so we're talking a truly red cow. They also interpret the statement upon which never came a yoke as meaning, quote, this is what they believe, and describes this red heifer, the requirements and qualifications. It must have never been used to perform any physical labor. In fact, using the animal in any physical sense at all would render it invalid, even for the slightest, most minor thing. Quote, I'm still quoting, this would include riding and even leaning on her. So don't lean on the cow. I mean, think about that. Literally, I mean, we're talking Old Testament kind of, wow, I mean, this is an exceptional description of how they're protecting it. Likewise, the Jews interpret the Hebrew word translated as heifer to indicate the cow must be 3 to 4 years old. Here's what's amazing, okay? 3 to 4 years old. Those red cows we talked about earlier that Hamas was aware of, you know what they likely realized? They're getting old. They're just about the right age. And so likely somebody in Hamas put it all together because those cows, when they came from Texas, were all between 1.5 and 2 years old. And so by 2023, when the October 7th day happened, the fact is that they would have been close to 3 years old. That age frame where the Jews say, okay, it could be ready to attack. The timing of the attack indicates the Muslims did not want the heifer to be able to be used to create the ashes for the purification process. They would have seen it as, oh, we're getting close. They would have interpreted, oh man, those cows are right about the same age. So probably the Jews are trying to take over the Temple Mount, and so we're going to do a preemptive attack on Israel to prevent it. They too are keenly aware. Many of us have seen the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem. Jews and even others sometimes offer prayers, but mainly Jews. And you know, there is a prayer that the Jews have been repeating for nearly 2,000 years. Since AD 70, when the temple was destroyed, the Jews have not ceased to utter this prayer, many of them 3 times a day. You know what it is? It's this. May it be your will that the temple be speedily rebuilt in our own time. That's their prayer. 3 times a day. Orthodox Jews. God, would you rebuild your temple in our lifetime, in our time? Secondly, okay, so first, it's very unique and the qualifications and such. Number 2, the heifer was burned completely. That's unusual for the sacrifices. Totally burned out, right? Her ashes were collected. They were stored for the ceremonial cleansing of people so that they would last for days and years to come, months to come, for that ceremonial purification. Look at verse 17 and 18, would you? Verse 17 and 18 of the same passage. And for an unclean person that should take of the ashes of the burnt heifer of purification for sin. What a great description. The burnt heifer, a purification of sin, okay? That's how it's described, or she is described here in these verses. And notice how it goes on. Verse number 17, and running water shall be put thereto in a vessel. And a clean person shall take hyssop and dip it into the water and sprinkle it upon the tent and upon all the vessels and upon the person that touched a bone or one slain or one dead or a grave. Okay? So these were special ashes in their minds that God chose to use for the nation to bring about the purification of unclean person. I love that description of verse 17. She is the burnt heifer of purification of sin. It was applied to a person, but did you catch what else it was applied to? Tent, vessels, and such. In fact, earlier on, what do we see happen? The very first thing that is done with the heifer is that the blood of the heifer is taken, and they are sprinkling that blood before what? The tabernacle, the temple. So understand it. They know and they understand we've got to have a temple in order to, and then when we have the temple, we have to have this ceremony of purification of the red heifer. We've got to kill it outside the camp, outside the city. We've got to take its blood, and we've got to use that blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the tabernacle and the temple. And then we take the ashes, we mix it with pure and clean water, and the Jews have all kinds of requirements and such for how they get the water and bring it back, and they mix it with the ashes and the hyssop, and they apply it to the tent and the vessels and such. So the Jews are foreseeing already they will purify the vessels to be used in the third temple itself. Okay? It is a safe assumption and conclusion that those who are leading the charge in rebuilding the temple are going to use the ashes of the heifer to purify the temple itself, the people, the priests, the vessels used within it. In fact, the Temple Institute has already been preparing for a long time the vessels, the utensils that are described in the Old Testament to be used in the temple to come. Everything except the Ark of the Covenant, which they're still hoping to find, by the way, and use within the third temple. Likewise, they've also prepared the priestly line. They've gone back, and as the Jews have always done, been very consistent and very thorough with tracing the hereditary lines of Jewish people. And as they have, and they have records of this, they're already preparing priests to serve in the third temple and consecrating them and getting them prepared and so forth. One of the aspects about the things of the preparation for the temple, they have already prepared, and this is not a picture of the one as far as I know that they prepared, but they've already prepared a menorah. Okay, you see the huge candlestick as God has described as being part of the tabernacle and things. The one that they have prepared for the future temple has 95 pounds of pure gold. Woo! That's a lot of gold, isn't it? It has a price tag of $2 million. Isn't that crazy? They're doing their best to follow the Old Testament and so forth and such. And they have prepared piece by piece everything for the third temple. It's taking shape, even to the degree of the priest's garments. As we see described in the Old Testament, they have recreated those in vessels of copper and gold and silver in a new generation of Levite priests specially trained for the temple service. 15 years ago, the director of the Temple Institute was interviewed. You know what he said? 15 years ago, okay? So 2010, right? My math is correct, okay? You know what he said? They interviewed him, they asked him about these things. Here's what he said. We have enough in place now to resume divine service and to build the temple. Isn't that amazing? But obviously, a lot of things have to happen for this to happen. It's an interesting statement. He's saying, listen, we made preparations. And like I said, this has gone back. I'm sure that there's been many a Baptist preacher that's preached a similar message to what I have last 50, 60 years because of the red heifer and the reality of it. They are prepared. We said before, and I said a week or two ago, reality is there are absolutely no prophecies yet to be fulfilled before Christ returns in the rapture for the bride. And the tribulation plays out. And the Jews are sitting there in the Temple Mount and in Jerusalem, and they're prepared. They're ready. They're ready for the day that this temple takes shape. And when he says, well, there's still a lot of things to happen, well, we've already talked about a lot of things that happen geographically, politically. The Antichrist comes on and establishes peace and makes this peace covenant and so forth. And it will happen right before the tribulation, during the first part of the tribulation. So hence the reason they're preparing the red heifer or have already done so. They have multiple red cows, red heifers over there, and likely maybe even already preparing some ashes and also having some ready to when the temple is built and so forth. Number 3, we would be amiss if we didn't mention this truth about this red heifer. The sacrifice of the red heifer, like other sacrifices, was an obvious and clear foreshadowing of Christ's sacrifice for us at Calvary. What did it describe the red heifer as having to be? Without blemish. Perfect. And Jesus Christ was our perfect lamb, wasn't he? He was without blemish. Interestingly, what had to happen to the red heifer? It had to be killed outside the camp. Where was Jesus Christ killed? Outside, Golgotha, right? He was taken outside the city. He was put to death there, crucified accordingly there. One of the most important applications of the ashes of the red heifer, and you probably caught it, was the cleansing of the contamination of death. In fact, one of the things that it was used for repeatedly and stipulated, you had to use the red heifer ashes for the purification. If you touched a dead body, if you touched a grave, if you had any contamination of death. I mean, what a great picture. Because you know what Jesus Christ did on the cross of Calvary? He saved us from the power, the penalty, and the presence of sin. Amen? The contamination of death. For the wages of sin is death. And so his sacrifice saves us from that penalty, that power, that corruption, and even the presence of sin. What a great picture. Paul in the New Testament, he understood how this picture was so poignant in the Old Testament. So he quoted it in the book of Hebrews. You remember us studying Hebrews chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. For the blood of bulls and goats, and then he mentions specifically, in the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifieth to the purifying of the flesh. How much shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve a living God? And I'll tell you, anytime you and I hear the red heifer, we may think immediately of end times. We may think of the future temple, and that's great. But I like to think more so, boy, that is a great picture of my Savior and what he did for me. The sacrifice of my Savior for me. So there's a great significance, all right? So this is in conclusion. So if you hung on this long, hang on just a second. We'll be done, okay? There is a great significance to this. This is why I bring it up in a message, and we talk about this red heifer. Many of you have heard about it before and so forth. Any Jews who spearhead the building of the temple, they'll no doubt insist on the ceremonial purification of the temple, the priests, the people, the objects used within it. Okay? But let me say this. Okay? For us as New Testament believers, as followers of Jesus Christ, those who've been saved, the rapture is not contingent upon a red cow. Okay? So, though that seems important and it is some indicator of things to come, may I just remind you that the rapture will happen when God tells Jesus Christ the Son, go and get your bride. We're not waiting for, the red heifer has to be shown in all of Israel and the temple has to start. No, we're not doing this. In fact, we're not even 100% sure that the temple can't be rebuilt without the red heifers and everything else. It will just seem from the Jews' emphasis and focus on this that the only way they're going to see a temple built is if they are ready to purify it through this ceremonial cleansing described in the Old Testament. Okay? Let me also be clear about this. I think this is crucial. Young people, we read about this in tribulation, how the temple is going to be reopened, how sacrifice is going to occur again. Can I just tell you, the God of heaven, the God of the Bible, and Jesus Christ do not require any type of sacrifices anymore. What the Jews will do in the tribulation as the temple is built and they start again the daily sacrifices, God does not want that. That is not required of God. They're doing it only because they've missed that the Messiah has come and paid the ultimate sacrifice. Okay, so understand context for you and I. It's somewhat of a sad reality that they're going to start these sacrifices back up because you know what it means? They've missed that Jesus Christ has already come. The Messiah has arrived. He's already been cut off, if not for himself, but for us. And so there is no need for animal sacrifices required in the tribulation. Christ has already fulfilled the law in its demands. He is the only sacrifice we need. Now, with all that said, can I just tell you, I can't help getting excited when we read of all this. When we study as we have tonight and say, man, the Jews, they are really anticipating the building of the third temple. They are really getting ramped up for this. We see the headlines of the last couple days and Middle East, and you're thinking, man, this is just setting it up for peace, for somebody to come along and being the savior, quote unquote, who brings peace to the Middle East and so forth. So I can't help get excited as we study this. We see things ramping up in the Middle East. Preparations being made for what we read here in Revelation chapter 11. Because you know what it means for you and I? Christ is coming back soon. He's coming back soon. The tribulation will happen. And one day, all will be right with the world when Jesus Christ sits upon the throne of David. That's the promise of Scripture. and he will be king. You know what I say to that? Oh, what a day that will be. We see all the signs. We see everything happening. Let it be encouraged. Let yourself be encouraged. Man, it's playing out just as God has. And as Brother Dave reminded us, even with the song, work for the night is coming. We don't know how much time we have left. Red heifer or no red heifer, Jesus Christ is coming again. And we look forward to it. Would you join me in standing? We'll dismiss with a song together. I appreciate your faithfulness.